Hey, welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to be setting up an independent reverse system. With that, let's get started. So the first place we're going to go is to the main menu to make sure that we are in the automatic transmission. So we're going to go to maps, main menu, the main menu level, and then we're going to hit play. We're going to go settings, gameplay. Then we're going to set this back to automatic. Then we're going to quit. We're going to go back to maps, workshop, open up the workshop level. Then we're going to head over to the parent vehicle. And then in the parent vehicle, just find an empty spot somewhere. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to create two custom events. So we're going to right click, look for custom event. And then this one, I'm going to call this the reverse system. And then we're going to create another one, just a little bit, just put some space between the two of them. Just right click, and then another custom event. And then this one, we're going to call it reverse with a question mark. And then in the variables, we're going to create two variables. So just create two variables. We're going to call this throttle input question mark. And then we're going to leave it as a boolean. Select the throttle input, control D. And then we're just going to rename this one to brake input, also a boolean variable. And then by the components, we're going to select the vehicle movement component. And then in the details, we're going to search for reverse. So we're going to uncheck the automatic reverse, uncheck that, and then also the reverse as brake, uncheck that too. Then we want to compile and then save. So we're going to start with the reverse system. So we're going to first drag in the gear change boolean for control, drag that in, drag off from there, look for branch, and then by the false, we're going to add a sequence, hold S and then left click, and then by the then 0, we're going to drag in the vehicle movement component, hold control, drag that in, and then drag off from there. And what we're going to look for is get forward speed. And then from the forward speed, we're just going to drag off. And then we're going to look for is it lesser than, and we're going to put this at 0.1. Going to create a branch, connect the condition, and then connect this to the then 0. For the true, we're going to drag in the current gear. So just get the current gear variable, hold control, drag this in, and then when I drag off from there, then look for equal, and then it's going to be either equal 0, and then just select the equals, control D, connect that to the current key as well, and then we're going to look for 1. And then from the top equal, going to drag off and then look for OR, and then we're going to drag in the brake input, hold control, drag in the brake input boolean, and we're going to drag off from the OR, and then we're going to look for and then connect the brake input to the AND, hold B, left click to create a branch, connect the condition, connect this to the true of the first branch. And then before I forget, we just need to go and add the custom events to the inputs. So we're just going to make some space here as well. So first going to do the throttles, drag this up a bit. And then by the throttle, also, okay, just going to make some space here real quick. Just drag this out a bit. And then we're going to select these sections and then drag this out. And then drag this out too. I'm going to drag in the throttle input. So hold Alt, drag in the throttle input, and then we're going to Control D this. So then the top one goes to the triggered. From the triggered, we're going to the throttle input, and then we're going to set this as true. Then from there, we connect this to the set throttle. Then from the completed to the second set throttle input, and it's going to remain as false. And then just connect this also to the set throttle input. So what this is going to do is it's going to trigger either true or false whenever the player presses the button. So when you are accelerating, then we're going to be it's going to tell the code that yes, the button is being pressed, and then if not, then it isn't being pressed anymore. We're going to use this for the reverse question mark, and then after the set throttle input, we're going to drag off, and then we're going to look for the reverse question mark custom event. So that is it for the throttle, and then we gotta do the same thing for the brake. So for the brake, by the triggered, instead we're not gonna have a brake input anymore, so we can remove this. So instead we're gonna go from the action value, drag off from there, and then promote this to a variable, and then we're gonna call this the brake value, and then connect this to the triggered. But before that, we need to drag in the brake input, hold Alt, drag this in, and then it needs to sit between the enhanced input and the set brake value by the triggered. Just connect that and then just set it to true. And then we're going to take the set brake input, Control B, and then from the completed, connect that to the second set it to false, and then connect that to the set brake input. And then we're just going to go from the set brake value and then just connect this back up with the brake light function. And then it seems as though I forgot to connect the action value to the set brake that's connected to be completed. So I'm just going to do that real quick. And then one thing I did actually forget to do is between the set brake value and the brake light function, we need to add the reverse system custom event. So we're going to add the reverse system. And then that is now the completed new setup for the brake input. So we're going to drag this back. So then back to the reverse system setup. What we're going to do is we're going to drag in the gear change variable, hold Alt, drag this in, connect it to the true. We're also going to set the gear change to true. Then we're going to drag in the vehicle movement component, hold Control, drag it in, and then drag off from there. And then we're going to set target gear to neutral, check the immediate, drag in the current gear variable, hold Alt, drag this in, connect the execution pin, and then we're going to set this to -1. Then we're going to drag off from there and then look for a delay. And then you can use the shift time if you want to. You can just drag the shift time and then put it on the duration, but I'm not going to do that. And then from there, we're going to select the set target gear with the vehicle movement component, drag over everything, Control D, connect the execution pin for the gear number, drag off, and then we're going to get current gear. And then we're going to drag in the gear change variable again, hold Alt, drag this in, and then leave it as false. And then going back to the first branch after the get vehicle speed here by the false, what we're going to do here is we're going to drag in the vehicle movement component, hold Control, drag this in. Then we're going to drag off from there, and then we're going to hit brake input. Then we're going to take the brake value, connect that to the brake, and then connect the execution pin. And then back to the sequence, the then one, we're going to drag in the current gear, hold Control, drag in the current gear variable. I'm going to drag off from there, look for equal. I'm going to do if it equal to -1. Then we're going to take the brake input question mark variable, hold Control, drag this in. Then from the equal, drag off and then look for and. Then connect the brake input, hold B, left click to create a branch. Connect the condition, connect this to the then one. Just going to drag this back a bit. And then we're going to take the vehicle movement component, hold Control, drag this in, drag off from there, and then we want to set throttle input on the true. Then we want to take the brake value and then connect this to the throttle. And then that is it for the reverse system. And then now we're going to do the reverse question mark custom event. So just drag this out a bit so there's some space. Then we're going to drag in the current gear variable, hold Control, drag this in, drag off from there, look for equal. If it's equal to -1, then we're going to bring in the throttle input question mark variable, hold Control, drag this in. From the equal, drag off, and then look for and. Connect the throttle input, create a branch, hold B, left click, connect the execution pin. If true, then hold Control. We're going to drag in, no, not Control, hold Alt, drag in the gear change. We need to set it, not get it. Connect the execution pin, set it to true. Then we're going to get the vehicle movement component, hold Control, drag this in, drag off, set target gear. Going to set this to neutral. check the immediate, drag in the current gear, hold Alt, drag it in. Then we're gonna set this to 1, drag off from there, look for delay, and then you can add the shift time. I'm gonna add the shift time to this, and then from there, take the set target gear in the vehicle movement component, select them, Control D, from the gear number, drag off, and then get current gear, and then hold Alt and drag in the gear change variable, and then leave it as false. So that is the whole reverse system. Just gonna drag over everything, add a comment. I'm gonna call this the reverse system, and then we're just gonna compile, save. The system does have a little bit of a problem, I guess you wanna put it that way. It's that the player doesn't have to actually hold the brake input the whole time. Once the car is in reverse, then the car will reverse by itself until the player hits the throttle, which also acts as the brake when the car is going backwards. So if you just press and hold, not press and hold, we just press the brake and then the car enters reverse gear and then the car will just automatically reverse. But you'll see what I mean in when we test it out. So just gonna head over to the workshop. I'm gonna save everything, play the level, I'm gonna exit the workshop, yes. And then if I press brake, so I've let go on, so from there, I let go of the brake. So after I press it and the car enters reverse, I just let go and then the car reverses by itself after that. Now I did try and figure out a couple of ways how to fix that. None of them have worked, but I'm still working on a solution for that. But other than that, the reverse system does work. So once the car is in reverse, as you can see, it enters reverse and then I let go and then it just keeps reversing until whenever. And then when you throttle, it goes forward. That is the reverse system. So now when you accelerate, unlike before when we use the chaos brake as reverse, then the car would automatically enter reverse. When you brake now, if you accelerate and you change gears, if you brake, the car will gradually shift through the gears until it gets to reverse, and then that's also the other thing. The other overlap between the two is that when you accelerate again, because in the automatic transmission, you're technically over the change up RPMs. When you start accelerating again, the car will then go through that motion until it then meets the requirements once again for the shift down. And then when you now go forward, your RPMs change and then the automatic transmission kicks in. So then it's now looking for the new conditions for shift up and it's going to do that. So as you can see, when I reverse and then I go maybe 80 kilometers, if I accelerate forward, the car's in third and then it shifts down second and then first and then it will do that once again. But so that's pretty much the little hiccups, I guess, with the system is that it doesn't really take into account the nuances of how a transmission works and the RPMs. It just looks for the conditions, and if they're satisfied, then it will do as it's instructed. So I need to add a little barriers, I guess, to add those little nuances in between. But other than that, this is, of course, a very simple version of a transmission system. It's not exactly taking into account everything. But other than that, it's a working system and it does what it's intended to do. So I think at least for that, it's good. You know, it's not the best, but it's pretty decent. So I just want to give a quick rundown of the code for just to clarify up some of the things that's going on here. So the first thing we do is, let me just explain here real quick. So this is gonna fire off every time the player presses the inputs. So it's constantly gonna be checking whether the input is true or false. So that is a persistent loop that's gonna be happening all the time. And then over here by the reverse system itself, first we're checking for the gear change. If a gear change is happening, then we shouldn't do anything. But much like with the automatic, we're only working with the false. So when it's false, we're gonna go for the then zero. So the first thing we check for is the car moving forward by a certain speed? Because we don't want the car to go into reverse at just any speed possible. We want it to only go into reverse when the car is basically crawling. Right? I think this is not exactly a um or near close to stationary, then the car will be able to reverse. If not, then we have the false condition for that. So if the car is basically going faster than a crawl, if you can imagine it in a way is in a manual car, if you were to put your car in first gear and then just let go of the clutch and then the car just moves on its own with that little bit of propulsion, it would kind of be at that kind of equivalent. So if the car is going any faster than that, then we should basically lock the player out or lock the car out from being able to go into reverse. Should bring down the speed a bit more. And that's where the set brake input comes in. So the reason why we have it here and not by the input itself is that if you were to put it there, there would be conflict between the reverse system and then the brake input. Because when you press the button, it's a digital input between 0 and 1. So when you press it, it's going to signal that the brake input is currently at 1. And with that, it's basically just going to make the car stand still because it's the brake input only functions as a brake input, nothing else. But with the brake as reverse, I don't know how Chaos does it, but they make it so that when you brake, the car also goes into reverse and it acts as a negative propulsion. But we don't want that. We want the car to only go into reverse when the car is near close to standing still. So that's why we put it over here instead. So it's part of the code. So when the car is going faster than a crawl, then we want to brake until the car is at crawl speed and then we can go into reverse. But if the car is in fact in the crawl state, then we check is the car in either neutral or first gear. Either one of these two will satisfy the condition. And then we're also checking if the player is holding down the brake input. So once these conditions are then met, then from there we initiate the gear change, which means there's no more power being sent. Then we go into neutral, set the current gear to -1, which is the reverse gear, add a delay, and then we officially set the system to be in reverse. And then from there, once that part is now initiated, we now have the second part, which is the then one. So if the car is, or the car's current gear is in reverse and the player is holding the brake, then we will use the brake input to then throttle the car backwards. Now, this is not a negated value, it's still a positive value of either 0 or 1. And then the reason why we're not negating it, turning it into a negative, is because the way I understand it is when the car is in reverse gear, whatever value you have, I think if we just check with the vehicle movement component, we go down to where the transmission is. So when you enter the reverse gear ratio, you set it as a positive value. But because I would assume if you were to create your own transmission, this is completely hypothesis. I haven't tested this to make sure whether it's true or not. As everything would be set into an array. Now, an array usually starts at 0 and then goes 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you think about when we set up the display for the gears with the switch on int, we had to make it so that the switch on int starts at -1, which would then be the reverse gear, 0 being neutral, and then 1 being first gear. How I view it is in the array that the chaos system creates, it sets the array to start at -1. So whatever value you add into -1 will tell the system that this value needs to be negated so that it creates a negative force. So it's in this case it will be -1 multiplied by 2.791, which is going to be a negative version of that number, right? So if you were to take the brake value, which at this point would be 1, and then negate it, you would then basically be canceling out the negative value that the chaos system created in the array already, right? So you'd have the negative 2791 multiplied by the negative 1, which then creates a positive. But now, because the system knows that we're technically supposed to be going backwards, the positive value will then force the car to stand still because the throttle is going to be a positive value, right? So it's negative and negative, which just cancels itself out. So we're just leaving the throttle as is, because if you just add the 1 to the negative value, you're just telling it, okay, you need to go full throttle backwards. That's why we're not negating the brake value and just leaving it as its normal value of positive 1 or 0. That's the reason for that. I did have another version of the system where it did negate the value, which resulted in about 50% of the cars I tested the system with to either not reverse or just stand still. So it was kind of like a hit or miss with that system. But now with this one, because we're not negating it, it does work on all the vehicles. So that was a learning experience for me. And then this is now for the reverse, which sits on the brake input action. And then for the throttle, we then check for the reverse question mark to see if it is in fact in reverse. So if the car is currently in reverse and the player is pressing the throttle input, then we're going to set the car into first gear right after the change neutral, and then it goes into first after the delay, which then acts as the brake to then stop the car from continuing to go backwards. Because at this point, when the car is already going backwards, the brake no longer works as a brake. The brake will just continue to tell the code that, yeah, we just need to continue going backwards. So it's not going to act as a brake. So we use the throttle then to then change the propulsion from negative, which is the negative 1, which is the reverse, to then into first gear, which then creates positive motion, which then also stops the car from going backwards. So now we telling the car, okay, we need to start going forward now. So you need to slow down and then start driving forward and then go through the gears. So that is pretty much the whole system for the reverse. I am going to be working on another version of this that does take into account the nuances of the transmission, so that it doesn't go into any gear higher than first when you are reversing, like we showed in the test, where it goes from reverse into third, and then as the car now slows down because it went from going backwards to going forward, then the car will then go from third, second, first, and then start going forward. Instead, what you want is the car to go backwards, go into first gear, and then remain in first gear until it actually starts moving forward. Instead of it going into third, then having to shift down to first, and then shifting back up as the car continues going forward. So then with that, having tested the code, making sure that everything works, that then brings us to the end of this video, and until the next one.